democratic decision-taking. I know that there are various other schemes, Albert and what's the name of the other guy? Albert and yeah, have produced a scheme about democratic planning, which I find very bureaucratic, and it comes back to, or it may come back to the same kind of situation and failures as the planning in Eastern Europe. So that's why what I propose is a kind of combination of democratic planning with an artificial market. But this would take us another 2 hours if you want more details about it.
Yeah.
You talked about in the 16th century, the usurpation of city power by national power and the medieval guilds being destroyed by increasing the international trade. And what I'm wondering is if you're proposing that the solution is not to go to a national level or an international level to try to control these economies, then why wouldn't, I mean, if one were like a global incorporated, why wouldn't one just say, take Burlington, take Santa Cruz, take Olympia, Washington, you can even take San Francisco and Boston if you want, and we'll take all the rest.
Can you please come a closer?
Sure. What I'm saying is, I mean, the problem that I'm turning over my head is that if you work on such a local level, it seems like there are very few communities that would really be interested in operating that way. That's my experience from having been around the United States anyway.
Yeah, but if you pay, you notice what I said is not that the economy would allocate resources at the community level. That is, the community would be the basic unit of political life and economic life, but the allocation of resources would be on a confederal basis. That means many communities would constitute a confederation, and this is where the allocation of resources would take place. Otherwise, I agree with you, it's a localist community could not work. I don't disagree with this. Okay.
How would you, on a practical level, how would you go about promoting that sort of establishment of confederations? I mean, or even, even say on a propaganda level, how would you go about advancing the idea of confederation rather than to the people who are saying we need strong national government, or we need to create a world government to deal with this world's economy?
But we don't have now strong national government. That's what is happening. Sorry, that's what's happening. Nation states are being now declining. That is, the economic sovereignty of the state now is declining every day. We don't have any more strong nation states. Okay, in your case, given that USA is a big country and it's the biggest market economy, you may still feel that you control economic life, but even this is not, even with respect to a big market economy like the US economy, even this is not true. That is, economic policies of the Clinton administration are determined what happens to the Wall Street and what happens to the stock prices and the bond prices every day. You know, of course, all the argument that it's actually the Japanese that financing the present standard of living of the American economy. To some extent, this is true, because they have bought the bonds, government bonds. So there is such a high degree of interdependence now between economies that even in the case of such a big market economy like the US economy, you can see that the state is not free to follow whatever policies it likes. So imagine what this means for smaller countries.
Okay, can I ask you to raise a couple of points? We seem to be living in a time when people who call themselves the leftists always take the given conditions and say, how are we going to work within them? For example, in the 1960s, among many people who call themselves anarchists, or whatever that word means anymore, they talked about decentralization and everything like that, which was physical. Now, everybody is trying to adapt to what exists and saying, how can you improve the present capitalist system? And I have to use the word capitalist, not just market economy, for reasons of my own. Because I think capitalism, Marx had only a kind of bare understanding and a brilliant understanding of where capitalist accumulation, commodity production was going. But he was writing in the 1860s. Now, I really begin to see capitalism truly, I don't believe it's decaying, I think it's maturing. You know, we used to say in the 30s and in the 40s, decaying capitalism, or moribund, dying capitalism. On the contrary, capitalism is growing and growing and growing. And it is capitalism, not just the market economy. But that's my point of view, and we can discuss that perhaps in one way or another. The thing that, first of all, disquiets me, after having, for example, read a person whom I like very much, Roy Morrison, and having looked over and being asked to write a blurb to the book, was that his ecological democracy is an adaptation to capitalism, and we're sort of going to do it, you know what I mean, bit by bit. We'll compete with Grand Union by establishing co-ops and whatever you have. Well, old co-ops, by the way, are undergoing degeneration, and Mondragon is changing radically, so that if I read the book that I endorsed, that he wrote years ago, I would feel that I couldn't put that in endorsement anymore, since it's now becoming more and more of a capitalist enterprise. And that is Mondragon. That is not, you know, the local head shop or the local food co-op or the local organic food place. What is it called again? You know.
I don't disagree at all.
Yeah, all right, no, I didn't say, I never said you disagreed. I just wanted to make a comment. I wanted to make a comment. The question of when capitalism really begins to mature, which Marx in some ways foresaw, but did not really fully foresee, really begins after the Second World War. Well, we did not realize how pre-capitalist we were by comparison with what happened after 1950, to be more precise. In fact, it was then that the peasantry was wiped out in France, which for 150 years formed the basis, you know what I mean, for the whole French economy. I mean, it really shaped the whole French economy because of the kind of internal market it produced. I don't want to go into that. I've had a lot to do with what I'm writing right now. The thing is, one, people tend to take the existing situation and they can't find any other alternative but working within it, you know what I mean, as though by working within it they can reshape it. I've just recently had a correspondence with the Social Democrat who's discovered confederal municipalism, and Edward Bernstein, you know what I mean, who's the revisionist of the Social Democrats in the Second International before the First World War. That's number one that I would like to just make a point of, if I may, in connection with what you have to say. The second thing is confederalism, confederal economics. Now, I just will finish after a moment. What do you exactly, how do you envision confederal control of the economy? I agree with you that there has to be confederation. I do not believe in self-sufficiency. The Unabomber has it, and looking at him, I think I've got a perfect example of self-sufficiency, you know what I'm saying? And there are a few other people out in Montana, you know, where I think self-sufficient people may want to migrate. But leaving that alone, the Unabomber and his complete self-sufficiency, up to the point where he makes his own nails, until he has to get a job every so often to make a trip and send off a bomb. Leaving that part aside, and the need to buy dynamite, he hasn't learned how to do that yet without buying it. And watching Kirkpatrick Sale working his Electric II typewriter as though he's gone back to the Paleolithic by doing so, without somebody telling him, you know, if I just pull out the plug, your typewriter is not going to work, and it depends upon this Niagara Falls and the huge dams and everything else that the self-sufficiency and simplistic Luddite living is going to provide. The thing that I wanted to get to as a question now is, how do you describe confederal control of the economy? Because this raises a real question of how that democracy is actually going to work. A confederal structure will necessarily have to be a council. It will have to be a council. Otherwise, it's not a confederal structure. You see, there's one difference between an assembly and a confederal structure. Now, if you're going to have a council, will that council have policy-making decisions? How will it make decisions for the economy? Because for the rest, I believe you accept the idea of a democracy based more or less approximating the Greek ecclesia or assembly. And you believe in a face-to-face democracy, a direct democracy, which is the only meaning democracy has. But at the council level, democracy now becomes more Republican. I mean this with a small r, I don't mean with just the Republican Party. How would that council actually work, although you must do it on the confederal level? There will be no place, with the possible exception of Samoa, or maybe not even Samoa, or Tahiti, or something like that, which can live, you know what I mean, in sunshine, naked, and just let coconuts drop down from the palm trees. Okay, there I see perfect self-sufficiency if you don't want a typewriter. But that's another question. All right? How would that work? How do you envision it?
Yeah. Let's come to the first point first about capitalism with respect to market economy. I agree that what we face today is the vast expansion of capitalism. But
just talk a little louder because I'm hard.
Yeah, I agree that what we face today is the vast expansion of capitalism, but what I tried to do was to make for systematic reasons, a distinction between the market economy and capitalism, because today, especially today, we have many people who support socialist market. And in fact, as I said, in countries like China, Vietnam, etc., they have at the moment, they say they have market economy, socialist markets. Sorry. They have socialist markets. So the question is that today it's not anymore theoretically possible as it used to be in the past, the socialist market economy. Today, many people say that we can combine a social ownership of the means of production with the market. And that's why I think it is important to talk generally about the market economy, which covers also this case. That's why I made the distinction. But I agree that in case you have private property relations and market economy, and of course this is capitalism. But I wanted to cover a broader thing. I wanted to cover also the case of socialist market, or socialist in quotation marks. Okay. Now the second question about how we can envisage a confederal economy and how it would work. Of course, as I said, this is what I try to do in the model in my book, which would take time tonight to discuss the details. But in general terms, what I could say is that first of all, you can introduce various kinds of safety valves. That is, the community assemblies elect delegates which are recallable, and therefore they have just to implement particular decisions of the community assemblies. Secondly, and this is interesting, there is a growing literature at the moment which shows that there are technological means of having an electronic democracy at the level of a confederation. You can have now an assembly, in other words, working through electronic means. Actually now there is a growing literature about this, which I think is very interesting. It shows that, in other words, you can have at various places community assemblies discussing and deciding on various issues, and these connected through an electronic network at the same time.
Okay, I understand. I agree with that approach. You bring it back to the community, and then back through you negotiate it through the assemblies. Yeah. In other words, that is confederalism. Yeah. It would merely be administrative. It would not be policy.
Yeah, of course.
And that's a big distinction, a very important one that is not understood.
Other question? Okay.
I know this 50 years is going to see some amazing changes. Amazing changes in 50 years.
Takis, I'm wondering how the critique of development fits into your politics. In the last issue of Society and Nature, you wrote an essay on development and democracy, and in there you make some distinctions. One of them is redefinition of North and South. To include, the South would include the 90% of the population in the Old South, plus the 60% in the north. That is excluded, as you explained. One of the types of resistance to the internationalization of the market that you favorably cite, I think, is a restoration of the commons. Groups in the South that attempt to reinvest or reestablish economic and political relationships within the locus of community. And this leads toward local self-reliance, a critique of development, a detachment from standards of progress like income and accumulation and consumer conveniences and so on. It seems that, and you didn't emphasize this, but it's the reinvesting in the commons is a type of regaining of economic competence as well as political competence. There's a challenge to the state to regain political competence and citizenship. What you indicated was through increased local self-reliance, people were able to provide more of the day-to-day livelihood. Agriculture, auto construction of housing, reskilling instead of dependency on buying from the market, right? Yeah. So the last part of this is that these reclaiming of the commons initiatives are typically very informal. That is, they aren't rigidly structured into political components, economic components, social components, and so on. But they're very fluid, often depending on kinship networks, or often they aren't democratic, but they're very adaptive to the situation. They make do. A commons may be something as mundane as a dump in a sense, where people will recycle the refuse from the dump and sell in the black market, all in an unregulated sphere, right? So you favorably cite that as an example of practice in the South to confront displacement of internationalization. But what you talk about here is it's very it's abstractly dividing up restructuring into economic democracy and political democracy and democracy of the household and so on.
I didn't refer to the sort of community attempts that you mentioned, and this was deliberate. I'll explain in a moment. But coming first to the North-South and the redefinition of the North-South, my intention was to show that in fact, the old divisions between North and South in terms of countries do not make sense anymore in an international market economy. Now we have to talk of a new South that is developing advanced capitalist countries. In countries like Britain, for example, where third world levels are developing now in many places, and this is official, and all over the world. So in fact, you have an expansion of the South into the North, and in this sense I tried to show, this was just an idea, I did not develop this argument further, that what we need is a new definition of the North and the South, where the North could include the 40% societies and the elites in the South, whereas the South would include the 90% whatever it is in the South, plus the 30 or 40% of the underclass in the North. But as regards the reclaim of the commons by community movements, etc., I don't believe that they have any chance. I don't believe that they have any chance in the present, if you take into account the present trends. If you take into account that in Pakistan at this very moment, slavery conditions have developed. You know that. They have developed slavery conditions because they want to expand their export economy. And there are thousands of children and grown-ups who work all their lives to repay loans under slavery conditions. That is, as long as these export economies are developing in the South, And as long as they are integrated more and more into this internationalized market economy, I think these community attempts are bound to fail. I can't see how they're going to compete and how they are going to survive within this condition when they are forced by market forces in order to survive. They are forced to be integrated into the market economy. They are forced to comply with the rules of the market economy. At the moment, they may try desperately to secure some survival within the market economy, but I can't see what chances of success they have within the international market economy.
I agree that they aren't adequately politically directed, often very adaptive, as I said, and unconscious of how they are operating in international framework. But there are some elements of them that are hopeful. The critique of development
is whether they have any chances to survive, and I don't think they have.
Well, as they exist, but they aren't going to stay the same in a static state. They're going to develop. They're likely going to disappear, perhaps. But do you see any potential there for developing in a different direction?
If you are talking in subjective terms, yeah, of course, if they develop the level of consciousness of people to understand these new forms of organization, of course, this may be a positive step. But in objective terms, I don't see that they have any chance to survive.
I agree with everything you have to say about the existing conditions, and as far as I understand your vision, I accept most of that too. But what I can't get a grasp on is that if all of these things are impossible under given conditions, how do we get to a point where there's going to be a confederal anything? If there's going to be these assemblies and whatever, where are they going to come from?
Can you speak up a bit?
If we're going to have assemblies and confederations and all of these things, where are they going to come from? Under everything I've heard so far tonight about the given conditions is telling me that this and this and this and this is impossible, but we must begin somewhere. So I'm wondering where the transmission is between the existing conditions and your vision, and how do you describe that political process which takes place in between?
Yeah, I agree. I think that there is a need for a transitional strategy to be designed, and in my book I try to do this, and to see how we can move from here to there through the organization of a new movement which would be inspired by the ideas of creating an inclusive type of democracy. And I think that today, especially, when even significant parts of the privileged social groups, not only the underclass, etc., face conditions of increasing insecurity, alienation, and they don't know what tomorrow will be, whether they have their jobs and their income and so on. I think, particularly today, the condition may be mature for the development of such a movement. Okay.
Such a movement being political?
But how do you think capitalism isn't? Do you think capitalism is going to just co-opt the cult of community the way that it did the cult of the individual? I mean, thus rendering any kind of confederalism ineffective.
No, of course, I'm not so naive to believe that capital would simply stand aside and see being destroyed. But I think that if this is a long discussion, we can start now. The strategy, I think, of confederal municipalism is a realistic one in the sense that creating power bases at a local level in order to destroy the present form of democracy and create new forms of democracy is a realistic approach, because if you start creating alternative institutions, alternative political institutions and alternative economic institutions at the local level, which at some stage confederate, then I can't see how such a movement would be stopped when it would have become the hegemonic, in ideological terms, the hegemonic movement. That is, capitalism would have lost the game, to put it simply, when the majority of the population start believing this sort of thing. That is, to use violence, okay, violence would be counterproductive if the majority has already been persuaded to such ideas. The problem might be in the transitional stage until you persuade the majority that they would use, of course, perhaps they may not use the physical violence, but they are going to use, this is the most important aspect, they would use economic violence to destroy you. I agree, there are all these risks, but this does not mean that you don't try.
On the slavery piece, I just returned from 3 months in Honduras last week and visited some of the sweatshops there. And when Paul asks about alternatives within the existing scheme or what might be developing, what seemed clear there was that they haven't reached bottom yet. And they haven't reached the bottom, that the foreign capital that's exploiting the displaced campesinos has a lot of workers left to absorb, and that slave conditions are better than starvation. And so the women, predominantly women in these shops, will last 10 to 12 years and their bodies collapse. For every one woman whose body collapsed, there's 6 more who really wants to get in that shop. And one of the things that was most optimistic for me was that as we speak, representatives from popular organizations from all of Central America and the Caribbean are meeting in San Salvador. They're understanding that the nation state in Central America cannot respond adequately to the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or Club of Paris or whatever, that minimally they have to have a regional strategy and a regional program. And the whole question of what is the transition? How do you begin to take power away from the international banking community? How do you begin to take power away from the capital in terms of Honduras? I mean, all the power is centralized in the federal government. How do you get power just to the local level? Budget matters to the local level. And those are all issues that those groups are, I think, beginning to address. But first and foremost, they've got to get out from under the heel of foreign capital. And I mean, the price of beans is going up because of the export economy, right? Beans are being taken out of production in order to export coffee or sugar or bananas or whatever. People, literally people are starving.
I agree, but actually some movements are already in existence which show that if you can radicalize what they are doing at the moment, you can go in this direction. I have many reservations about the Mondragon experiment. I don't know whether you've heard about it in Spain. They have a community bank network which covers a vast area, which absorbs local savings and invests them in creating community projects. As I said, I have many reservations, but this shows that it's not impossible. That is, you can create an alternative banking system, you can create, for the transitional period I'm talking about, you can create alternative economic institutions which would start creating the precondition for the movement to an alternative society. It is what I said before, the municipalization of community resources and self-reliance and so on. But in this transitional period, there are possibilities, there are ways you can use. They have been tested even in practice, not only Mondragon, there are various other schemes, credit unions, etc. But what I disagree with these experiments is that if they are done on a community initiative basis, that is, if they are not done through the creation of some sort of local power base, by winning, say, local elections, I don't think that they can succeed. The Mondragon case is, to some extent, an exceptional case. Because you cannot have them in a massive scale. That is, you can always simply they will go to the next supermarket branch where they can buy cheaper. And that's the end of many co-op attempts. So that's why I think that you have to create local power bases so that you can start from somewhere to create on a massive scale this sort of new institutions. Any other question?
We all agree.
Sorry?
We all agree.
Okay, well, that's good.